Welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever felt like you were literally being pulled in completely different directions by your own thoughts? Like one part of you just wants to totally indulge in something, while another part acts like a super strict parent telling you no? Well, Sigmund Freud's structural model of personality gives us a pretty brilliant framework for understanding exactly why that happens. Today, we're going to explore this intense internal conflict using only the insights mapped out in our source material. All right, here's today's agenda. We'll start with number 1, the structure of personality, followed by number 2, the id and the pleasure principle. Then we'll look at number 3, the ego and the reality principle, and number 4, the superego and the moral branch. Finally, we'll wrap up with number 5, ego defense mechanisms. Okay, let's jump right into section 1, the structure of personality, the inner battlefield. To truly grasp this model, it is absolutely crucial to understand what we mean by structure. We are not talking about anatomy here. If you were to scan someone's brain, you wouldn't find a little physical compartment labeled ego. No way. Instead, Freud's primary structural elements, the id, the ego, and the superego, are conceptual forces. They reside deep down in the unconscious mind, and we can only really figure out they exist by observing how people actually behave in the real world. Think of your unconscious mind as this giant hidden reservoir where a constant tug of war is just always taking place. You have these 3 distinct entities locked in a permanent struggle. Seriously, every action you take, whether it's making a massive life decision or just intensely debating whether to eat that second donut, is the direct result of this ongoing competition. Whoever pulls the hardest is ultimately going to determine how you act. Moving right along to section 2. ID, the pleasure principle, the primitive force. So the id is the original, raw source of all our instinctual energy. If the mind is a battlefield, the id is absolutely the wildest, most impulsive combatant out there. It operates purely on immediate gratification. It doesn't care about the rules, it doesn't care about manners, and it definitely doesn't care about other people. It is entirely focused on primitive needs, aggressive impulses, and sexual desires. It simply wants what it wants, and it wants it right now. This relentless, driving energy is powered by instinctual forces. Freud theorized that the id is energized mostly by a life force known as the libido. And the absolute golden rule of the id is what Freud called the pleasure principle. This principle assumes that we just naturally seek out pleasure and try to avoid pain at all costs. Because the id operates strictly on this pleasure principle, it completely ignores society, it ignores moral values, and it ignores the realities of the external world. It's just raw, demanding energy. That brings us to section 3, ego, the reality principle, the pragmatic manager. You see, if we all just acted purely on our id, society just wouldn't function. We'd all just be grabbing whatever we wanted like toddlers. So, out of the id, the ego grows. The ego's whole job is to satisfy those instinctual needs, but to actually do so in accordance with reality. While the id is super demanding and totally unrealistic, the ego is patient, it's reasonable, and it's grounded. It operates on the reality principle, steering the id towards ways of behaving that are actually safe and appropriate in the real world. Let's actually look at how this dynamic plays out. Say a young boy sees an ice cream cone. His id is literally screaming at him to just snatch the cone and stuff it in his mouth. I mean, that's immediate gratification, right? The pleasure principle in action. But then his grounded ego steps in, working on the reality principle. The ego knows that just grabbing the ice cream is probably going to end in a punishment, so the ego tells the boy, hey, actually, the most realistic way to get that delicious ice cream is you just ask for permission first. Now, for the final piece of the puzzle, section 4. Superego, the moral branch, internalized authority. Enter the superego. You can think of the superego as this strict, finger-wagging moral branch of your mind. Through the whole process of socialization, we internalize the authority and the rules of our parents and our society, and that essentially becomes the superego. Its main job is to tell both the id and the ego whether a particular desire or action is actually ethical. Going back to our ice cream example, when the boy asks his mother for the cone, his superego signals that this behavior is morally correct, meaning he could enjoy his treat without feeling any guilt, fear, or anxiety. So, here is the absolute crux of it. Your mind is a chaotic battlefield where the impulsive id and the highly moral superego are just constantly going at it. The id is whispering, do it feels good, and the superego is yelling, don't do it, it's wrong. And right in the middle is the poor ego acting as the mediator, desperately trying to satisfy the id without offending the superego or, breaking the rules of reality. Freud actually believed that a person's psychological stability is entirely determined by the relative strength of these three competing forces. And that leads us to our final section, number 5, ego defense mechanisms, emergency protocols. So what happens when the clash between the id's wild desires and the superego's rigid rules gets to be just too much? Well, it generates a tremendous amount of really uncomfortable anxiety. According to Freud, a massive chunk of human behavior is actually just an attempt to deal with or escape from this exact anxiety. To protect itself from totally being overwhelmed, the ego deploys emergency protocols. It develops what we call defense mechanisms. A defense mechanism is basically a way of turning down the volume on that anxiety by actually distorting reality a little bit. They try to defend the ego against the painful awareness of our own unacceptable instinctual needs. Now, it's super important to note that using some defense mechanisms is totally normal and adaptive. We literally all do it. However, if a person relies on them so heavily that reality becomes truly distorted, it can definitely lead to various forms of psychological maladjustment. And the crazy part? People are usually completely unaware that they're even using these tactics. The absolute most important foundational one of these mechanisms is repression. This is what happens when anxiety-provoking thoughts, feelings, or desires are totally, completely dismissed and buried by your unconscious mind. You literally become unaware that the wish even exists. So this is exactly what's happening when someone genuinely says, "Man, I have no idea why I just did that." Actually, what happened is a repressed desire from their id managed to bubble up and express itself, but their conscious mind completely blocked out the true motivation. But beyond repression, there are a bunch of other everyday tactics we use too. Take projection, for instance. This is when people attribute their own unacceptable traits to someone else. Like a person who harbors really strong aggressive tendencies might constantly complain that everyone else is being overly aggressive. I mean, we probably all know someone who does this, right? Then there is denial, where a person totally refuses to accept reality at all. Like someone suffering from a severe illness who just completely denies they are even sick. There's also reaction formation and rationalization, and they all serve the exact same core purpose, protecting the poor ego from the painful truth. Freud's model paints such an incredibly dynamic picture of human nature, showing us that our everyday actions are so often the result of this massive hidden struggle. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to apply to your own inner battlefield. When you face conflict in your life, is your ego truly dealing with reality, or are your defense mechanisms simply distorting it to keep you comfortable? Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring the incredible mechanics of the mind.